Alright, so in this lecture we're going to pick up where we left off with the First Punic War, and then continue on with the Second Punic War and Roman expansion to the east. By way of refresher, as you can see on the map here, what we have is the proximity that Rome shared with Carthage. If you look at the bottom of your screen near the bottom of Italy, what you'll see is just how close Sicily actually was to Rome. The Carthaginians had a bit of a presence there. You can see just to the west of Italy, or Sicily, you can also see that Carthage itself is not that far. And remember that they are a seafaring empire. All right, so when we left off, we had actually gotten to the point where the Romans were actually building ships, and they were in the process of fighting the Carthaginians and actually being relatively successful. So in terms of just a quick recap of where we were, the timeline of the war itself, if you notice, lasts almost 2 decades. So we have almost 20 years of war that takes place between these two powers. And remember that Rome is sort of the underdog here because they do not have an official navy yet, or had not official navy when the war began, but they will very quickly, building 120 ships in approximately 2 months. The Romans were incredibly successful against the Carthaginians at the Battle of Mylae in 260. In fact, they were so successful, and it was so unexpected by the Romans, that they ended up taking the beaks of the ship, the front ramming portion of the ship, known as a rostra. They took that to the Forum in Rome and actually put them around the speaker's platform, which is why the speaker's platform that we mentioned last time is called the rostra. So a very big victory for the Romans and a very large defeat for the Carthaginians. And it would stay that way, actually, for a little while. Unfortunately for the Romans, within a few years they decided that they should just bypass Italy or Sicily and head straight to North Africa and invade Carthage. And if you recall from when we met last time, one of the invaders, one of the Roman commanders, was Marcus Attilius Regulus, and he had decided that with the help of other Romans and the support of other Romans, that the invasion of Carthage would be a good thing as opposed to just focusing on Sicily. It was not a good thing. When Regulus landed, he was terribly defeated, or the initial landing was terribly defeated, particularly since they ran into elephants, and that did not work out well for the Romans at all, as we'd seen in their war with Pyrrhus. And so the first Roman army is defeated. A second one actually ends up being somewhat successful, but ultimately, because of poor planning on the part of the Romans and overextension, they were defeated. The remainder of Regulus's army was actually picked up by a Roman rescue fleet, but unfortunately that fleet, which was made up of over 350 ships, was caught in a big storm, and most of those ships, with all of their evacuees, sank in the Mediterranean, leaving only about 60 or 70 or so intact. So they lost massive amounts of men, both in the defeat itself and then in the rescue operation. One of the things to note about Regulus and Roman sort of attitudes towards their enemies at this point, at least the Carthaginians, is that in one of his early successes in battle against the Carthaginians before this great defeat, Regulus had actually won against the Carthaginians and had engaged in negotiations with them, and because he had defeated them so soundly in this battle, he imposed insanely harsh terms on them that, had he dialed those back a bit, the Carthaginians probably would have accepted. But as it was, the terms were so harsh, coming from Regulus, that the Carthaginians decided not to, and they did not enter into peace negotiations ultimately. They continued to fight, and that is actually what led to Regulus's defeat. So had he not been as arrogant in his dealings with Carthage, it may have turned out differently here. The other thing to consider in terms of Regulus is that apparently he may have learned from his mistake and tried to regain his honor, and he told the Carthaginians that he would go to Rome and negotiate a peace with the Romans, and they let him go to Rome on the condition that they didn't assume this would actually work, but they let him go to Rome on the condition that if the Romans didn't accept these treaties of the defeated, that since he was actually taken as a prisoner of war, that he would return. And as you can see from this much later image here, Regulus, he went to the Senate. They declined the negotiations, the surrender negotiations for him, and being true to his vow, he ended up returning, and that's sort of his wife fainting and his children tugging at his robes, where he boarded the ship and returned to be a prisoner of war in Carthage. So he's done sort of two things. One, really bad in terms of his initial terms with the Carthaginians, and then second, trying to uphold those good old Roman values by keeping true to his word and returning to Carthage. The remainder of the war has, after this defeat, the Romans give up on doing anything with North Africa itself, and instead, for quite some time, they will spend focusing just simply on Sicily. In fact, most of the action happens in and around Sicily itself. Unfortunately for the Romans, again, one of the things that's going to happen is that they are going to suffer continued losses at sea, particularly in 249 off of Drepana. Now, this story about the Romans and their misfortune is a little bit more elaborate than that of Regulus. In this case, the Roman commander, Publius Claudius Pulcher, according to some versions of the story, had decided that he wanted to launch this invasion of Carthaginian territory and take on their navy, potentially some of the forts that were there on the island. And the problem he was running into is that the augurs, remember those who take the signs of the birds from the gods, brought to his attention that the sacred chickens that were on board the ship were not eating the feed that was given to them. And because of that, the augur said, that's not a good sign. We can't go to war. But Pulcher was incredibly impatient and decided that he didn't want to wait around for that. And he got very angry, and with the chicken cages up on the deck of the ship, he kicked them over the side of the ship into the sea and said, if they will not eat, let them drink. And the chickens drowned. Now, of course, that's sacrilegious, and a violation of that term we'd seen before, the Pax Deorum. And sure enough, he got his comeuppance because his fleet was mostly wrecked in a storm, and many of his sailors, including himself, were taken prisoner. He ultimately escaped and was shamed in Rome for screwing up so badly. So you should always remember the story of Publius Claudius Pulcher and the chickens. Never kick chickens overboard. Remember the Romans say, if you're looking for signs from the gods, you can't ignore those because somehow it will come back to bite you, because that's arrogance. What happens in the meantime is while the Roman fleet is pretty much destroyed, that's two major destructions of the small Roman fleet. The Carthaginians, led by Hamilcar Barca. Barca, by the name, was the sort of nickname given to him, which sort of translates to blitz or lightning attack, because of his incredibly fast raids on Roman ships and Roman forts and the Italian coast itself. And so for the next several years, in fact, Barca was involved in a counterattack against the Romans and a resurgence of Carthaginian power. And actually he was incredibly successful with that and pretty much put the Romans on their heels and could have inflicted some major defeats again. I mean, he did inflict major defeats, but he could have inflicted the ultimate defeat on them by completely obliterating their navy and forcing them to sue for peace. But the problem that happened in Carthage, and that we'll see later happening in Rome, is that a different group of people came to power in Carthage, and they were concerned that Barca was getting too much, he was having too much success, and then they were worried that he was making too much of a name for himself and possibly posing a threat. They also had, the people who came to power were landed aristocrats, and they were more concerned about problems to the interior of Carthage. And so they decided to rearrange their priorities. And in rearranging their priorities, they decided to focus on Tunisia. And one of the Carthaginian leaders, named Hanno, I know we have Hamilcar, Hasdrubal, Hanno, and later Hannibal, but Hanno, so-called the Great, decided to mothball the fleet in 244, right at the height of Barca's successes. So he mothballs the fleet, and he puts it away, and he converts essentially all of the naval officers, the sailors, and everybody on board ship into essentially a land army to fight in Tunisia for their landed interests, which, as it seems to make sense, allows the Romans time to rebuild their fleet. The Romans actually are able to call upon, they're almost out of money, the state is, and so they call upon their wealthiest citizens to essentially loan the state money, which they do, and it works. The Romans are successful, and by 242, they're able to turn around their former losses on the sea and fight back against the Carthaginians very successfully. In fact, they're so successful with it, they catch a Carthaginian fleet that was coming to resupply Sicily, and they pretty much take it over, destroy most of it, and confiscate all of the goods. And the Carthaginians, who had troops on Sicily, because they have no access now to the island and their people, are now forced to sue for peace. And the Romans will really sort of stick it to them. In terms of the peace settlement, this is what the Romans demand. First off, Sicily becomes almost entirely under the control of Rome. There are some quasi-independent cities like Syracuse that are there, but the Carthaginians cede all control to Rome. They no longer have that. The Romans decide also that they're going to make the Carthaginians pay for war, and this means that they're going to have to pay what's called an indemnity, a war debt or a war tax. And the amount that they have to pay is approximately 3,200 talents that they have to pay over 10 years. In order to understand sort of how that works, each talent is worth approximately $1.5 million. So this is 3,200 talents, and this is in pounds of silver. In sort of today's standard, that would equal about $4.77 billion that the Carthaginians have to pay to the Romans, which definitely increases the Roman treasury. Carthage also is not supposed to impede any Roman interests at all, and that is sort of a vague statement there, but especially Roman interests in and around Sicily and mercantile interests, Carthage is supposed to keep to itself. Now that's at the end of the First Punic War, but almost immediately after that, the Romans and the Carthaginians have some more issues, particularly around the islands of Sardinia and Corsica, just to the north of Sicily. The basic story there is that there are still some mercenaries in those territories that are harassing Carthaginian settlements and forts, and the Carthaginians, although at first they are actually aided by the Romans actually help them with their own military, help the Carthaginians put down the mercenaries. The problem is like what happened in Carthage. In Rome, a new group of aristocrats come to power, and they are very anti-Carthaginian. They pull their support from Carthage and essentially use the Carthaginian military presence in Sardinia and Corsica, which they had just approved, as means to go to war with them. And so they threaten the Carthaginians with war if they do not withdraw. And the Carthaginians do, and the Romans decide that they will then increase, rather than go to war with them, that they will force the Carthaginians to pay. So the indemnity is increased by 1,700 talents. Right? So you have to think that that is almost half again. So we're looking at another sort of $2.5 billion or so, $2.25 billion that's added to what the Carthaginians have to pay. And they lose Sardinia and Corsica. They have to give that up. And these become the first Roman provinces. And that Rome has outside, this and Sicily become the areas that the Romans have outside of Italy proper. So by the end of the Second Punic War, in 241, the Romans have definitely moved ahead in terms of their territorial gains, but also in monetary gains as well. And this will not be lost on the future generations of Romans. It'll also not be lost on the Carthaginians as well, because this sort of humiliating defeat and Roman deceit that takes place will be remembered by people like Hannibal Barca. And he'll blame the Romans for this. In fact, that becomes kind of a motivating factor, or at least mythologized motivating factor in the Second Punic War. All right, so this is going to continue in Part 2.